Thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to talk from my perspective both as a paediatrician working at the Royal and dealing with kids who come through the door injured, dealing with families who've lost a child or a loved one in car accidents. But I know very much that fixing this problem and trying to make the outcomes better for Tasmania are going to involve all of us working from very different angles together as a community to try and make life safer. Vince mentioned that I'm chair of COPEM. COPEM's an independent body that advises government and the coroner on obstetric deaths, perinatal deaths and child deaths. And it's one of our rather grim responsibilities to go through the details pertaining to every child who dies in Tasmania. It's very sobering. Some of the deaths are not preventable. However, a large group that continually stand out to us, and COPEM have made recommendations over at least the last 6 to 7 years, are the road traffic accident deaths. This is an area where we're losing Tasmanian children and we potentially could lose fewer. And I'd really like to see that change in my working lifetime. We are also meant to collect data on child morbidity, so injuries and disabilities. We haven't been doing a great job of that yet. We've been fairly overwhelmed with the deaths alone, but we know that road transport accidents actually account for a huge number of the hospital presentations and kids who leave our hospital injured, disabled, and with ongoing suffering and costs to their family. So this is a really important area, I think, for us as a community. My original title was going to be Tasmania Child Deaths, What Can We Do Better? But I thought we'd keep it simple and stay on MVAs. Okay, this is a scene from actually the news today, a multi-vehicle smash on the Hume Highway in Sydney, people being extricated, 1 dead and 14 injured. And I think these are things that many of you would deal with day to day in your life, particularly the police and the road transport officers at the front. This is something where you can't imagine how people would ever survive unscathed. It's happening daily. We get great drama in our news about shark attacks or murders, and yet more people die and suffer because of our roads than any of those causes. Okay, death by injury. You might notice that I'm not saying accident very often when it comes to child death. Injury is a much easier term for us. Accident implies that nothing could be done and things couldn't change. Oh, it was just an accident. And yet with the majority of childhood injuries, they're not really accidents. There are things we can do to prevent them. We know that worldwide, and this is WHO data which the UN has based its road transport safety campaign on, that injuries are the leading cause of death of all children once they pass the age of 1. It's the leading cause of death for people between 15 and 44 years of age, and the most common cause of death within that injury category is road transport associated death. Who dies and who gets injured? It's the most vulnerable people. So for me as a paediatrician, I'm always thinking of children. Children are pedestrians who get knocked, they alight from cars, they're often poorly restrained in cars. And in a society like ours, this is one area where we can do things better. We know that for every child who is killed, there are at least 2,000 who are left with injuries of varying significance, some disabling. And the disability adjusted living years are very significant for road transport associated injury. You can see here it's 1/4 of deaths worldwide from injury are related to road traffic accidents, and as the developing world motorises more and more people are dying. What does that mean for us? Here in Australia, we have 60 to 80 kids who die on our roads every year. It's a pretty big number when you think about our population. More than 3,000 are seriously injured with prolonged hospital admissions and ongoing disability on discharge. In Tasmania, we know that our rates vary a lot. We've got a small state and numbers of children are smaller than the mainland combined. So our statistics are not always significant. We can get jumps of a number of deaths that appear large. However, if you average out our deaths, child deaths from accidents over the last 5 to 10 years, our transport-associated death rate is actually higher than the Australian average. So we have more kids dying in from transport-related causes than the mainland by a very small factor. And I think this is something we can do better. 2010 was a horrible year for children on Tasmanian roads. We lost 5 children in road transport accidents. 2011 we lost one, 2012 we also lost one child, which was a pedestrian versus motor vehicle death. Most of our stats aren't separated out in what's published in terms of who died how, because we do need to protect the privacy of grieving families. But a significant number of these deaths are related to poor restraint, poor position in the car, or poor alighting practices from cars. So kids getting out of cars on the traffic side rather than on the curb side. What happens to kids who are involved in traffic accidents? Head injury is probably the leading cause of disability and death. Kids' heads are big, they move rapidly when a car decelerates and stops, they get hit by moving objects, and the growing brain is very susceptible. Brains are like jelly. Even when we decelerate and stop against a airbag in a car, the act of the body stopping, the brain keeps reverberating within the brain box. So the injuries to the brain include bleeding, bruising, shearing of neurons, the cells that connect areas of the brain. So children who survive are often left with significant brain injuries. These can range from not concentrating well at school and going from being a good student to struggling academically and socially. They can be more significant, with kids really struggling to get on with the tasks of daily living. Spinal cord injury is probably the next most significant issue we see. Spinal cord injury involves the head flexing against the body, putting pressure on the spinal cord and damaging it. That can occur without fractures to the spine and can lead to paralysis, continence problems, difficulty with mobility and independent living. A significant number of our younger serious spinal injuries die, and those who live have a significantly decreased quality of life. Bony fractures are common. Big bones in kids are very bloody. They make a lot of the bone marrow and cells, so a child fracturing their femur can die from loss of blood. Fracturing a pelvis can lead to death by penetration of bodily organs, by fractured bone pieces, bleeding out. It's all pretty grim. Chests are pretty soft in little kids. They do a bit better than us as grown-ups, but it's very common post-traffic accident for children to be having tubes in their chest, assistance with breathing, assistance with blood pressure. It's a pretty horrible place to be. We love it when we see a kid walk out of a road traffic accident or is brought in by the police or the ambulance afterwards who appear relatively unscathed. We tend to bring them back the day after just to make sure that there aren't injuries that they haven't been noticing because of the shock and horror of the situation. But we always congratulate parents roundly on their choice of car, their defensive driving actions and restraining their children, because the kids we see who walk away are the ones who've been well restrained appropriately in appropriate cars. Just to get a bit of a human impact side to this, I have looked after 4 children that come to mind readily over a prolonged period of time following road traffic accidents. One girl is wheelchair bound and has been living in a wheelchair since she was 5 years of age. She was wearing a lap sash belt when she was too small, flexed around the lap sash belt as the car decelerated in a low-speed accident and damaged her spinal cord. I've got one boy who was in a ute, front seat passenger, no rear row of seats, hit by a log truck, significant head injuries. His mum sends him to school with a notebook every day because by the time, let's call him Jim, arrives in his classroom, he can't remember whether he was meant to be buying lunch, catching the bus home, walking with his cousin. It's a pretty tough life, and there's a lot of planning through MIAB about how we're going to get this lad out to school. Another young lady I looked after lost her mother in the car accident in which she suffered significant head injury. She has a hemiplegia, so an arm that's bent and fixed and flexed and won't ever right again, and a leg that is shorter than the other and stiff. She falls frequently, she's struggling to learn how to make her own lunch, to budget with money and to get about. She won't drive. I hope she can work when she's older. She's a gorgeous kid. But they're 3 lives that have been markedly changed by a simple road traffic accident. All 3 of those children, had they been placed differently or restrained differently, would not be suffering the way they do now. Their families, extended families, school communities, friends, would not be worrying about what could have been had things been done differently on the day of the accident. This is how many of our kids would look. This is unfortunately a genuine photo from the Chinese news about a young lady from a motor vehicle accident. She was on a motorbike unrestrained. Head injuries, spinal injuries, chest injuries, abdominal injury, fractured pelvis, fractured leg. Unfortunately, pronounced brain dead. The Chinese have only just started an organ donation program and are hailing her as a hero. For me, reading that article, I just thought of the tragedy of loss and how preventable things can be. This is what we don't want to see. So how can we prevent young people losing their lives and losing their futures in our roads? There's lots of things, and many of you will be far more expert than me in these areas. There's a lot of stuff about roads, planning roads in communities, dividing roads, planning areas so that we don't have trucks running through small towns, that schools are placed on decent roads. That's beyond my ken as a paediatrician. We can do things about vehicles. Again, much better for an engineer type boffin than me, but we know that there have been major changes in cars with crumple zones, decent braking systems, passenger support, airbags, and these have significantly reduced improvements in roads and cars have made significant differences to our road toll in Australia in the last 10 to 20 years. Road users is probably the area where, as a paediatrician, as a mother, as an auntie, as a driver myself, I think we can potentially have the most impact. What can we do about road users? We know there's lots of great campaigns about speed and speed cameras, and there's some data about decreasing speed, decreasing injury. That's fabulous. Working to decrease drug and alcohol affected drivers being on our roads is a wonderful thing. We are sick to death of alcohol-related violence and injury coming into our hospitals, and alcohol plus cars is a combination that just shouldn't be seen. Driver training, which I think we do pretty well down here in Tassie. Personal restraints for drivers. We still see adults coming in completely unrestrained, going through the windscreen, being thrown from cars. But child restraints. Children are vulnerable. They don't decide what they get in and put on in the car. It's our choice as adults. And this is something where we can make a big difference to outcome data for kids. So, in October 2013, I think Jenny will be aware of this, but Kids Safe Australia, a fantastic injury prevention group, not-for-profit, released new child car restraint guidelines and recommendations. Good thing about this is it's based on evidence. So it's NH and MRC backed, looking at the data we have about accidents, injury and prevention. And it's been also backed by the Neuroscience Association of Australia. It's unlike many medical and boffin-like documents, it has a fantastic user-friendly consumer document, health professional document, road professional document, and it's all available through the Kids Safe website. What's different in the guidelines? As Vince said, lots of people don't get it. They don't know what's legal, they don't know what's best. Rear-facing child restraints are fantastic. They're probably the safest way to restrain a small child from birth in a car. A lot of parents will have the child in there until the kid starts squawking. Oh, he wants to see what I'm doing. We really better turn him around. The old capsules only kept kids safe probably till they were about 6 to 9 kilograms. However, that belief has persisted, and yet child capsules have improved greatly. Newer capsules can hold children for up to 2 years, keeping them rearward facing because there is a far lower risk of spinal injury and head injury in children facing back towards the seat and anchored in the back seat of the car. The idea with a child rear-facing infant restraint is to use it for as long as possible, as long as the child fits and it meets manufacturing guidelines. The other important thing with rear-facing restraints is, in this age of internet shopping, which is increasingly common, we need to be careful that parents are buying what's best, and what's best for Australian rules is actually one of the safest guidelines in the world. The strap that you can see coming around baby's head, which goes back to the anchor point in the car, which the RACT will check for you and make sure you've got it in the right place and are connecting up well, is a really important part of the child restraint because it pulls the seat backwards to the seat, towards the back of the car seat in an accident. Some of the more freely available types on the net do not have top restraint. I think it's really important that we encourage, as professionals in childcare, education, schools, roads, to get people to buy the best restraint that meets Australian guidelines and have it checked. When your squirt gets too big for their rearward facing seat, we put them in a forwards facing seat. Some of our Australian standard approved rearward facing seats turn around, so parents get 2 uses out of 1. A front-facing restraint has a 5-point harness, so the shoulder straps, the waist straps, and a crutch strap to stop the child shooting out under the seat. And these are really important that they're built in. These are the best way of restraining children from 2 years, or too heavy for their restraint, up till at least 4 years. Again, the newer restraints are holding kids for longer. Being a not small person, I tend to have not small children, and it was very hard 10 years ago to find restraints to keep big kids in. Kids who still fell asleep and flopped out of belts. And it's great to see that some of the restraints on the market now are great for the big kid, the more solid kid, the taller kid, and they can stay in these restraints for longer. What's interesting, KidSafe say, and the national guidelines say, till at least 4 years. Most kids actually are safe to be in these restraints until they're 6 or 7 years of age. How many kids do you see being dropped off at your local childcare centre or kindergarten, prep, grade 1, in a proper forward-facing seat with built-in restraint? We just don't see it, do we? And we need to change that community acceptance, because kids should be restrained like this in cars for a long time. What do your standard 5-year-olds do when they fall asleep in the car? Do they sit up straight or do they flop? They tend to flop after they've finished saying, "Are we there yet, Mum?" And they go out through their belts and slide sideways. So having that strap with the buckle low over the waist is incredibly important about keeping them safe when they're snoozing or exhausted after a great day of fun. Next step up is the lap sash belt, and this is probably where we see the most abuse of the child restraints. I am terrified when I see children tucking the shoulder strap under their arm because, "Oh, it rubs my neck, Auntie, I can't put it here." Or parents putting kids on cushions instead of a booster and on a lap sash belt. As mentioned before, one of the biggest injuries is either children flexing around the sash part of the belt or shooting out under the lap belt. And use of a lap sash belt with a proper booster seat holds the lap belt around the waist, where it's not going to injure stomach, liver, spleen, which are all out here, but holds the pelvis. They'll get bruised, but they're not going to kill vital organs if the strap's nice and low. It stops them shooting out from under the seat because of the side supports, and they're very important that parents use these properly with the lap sash belt and guides. These can be used till kids are at least 12 years old, or 145 to 150 centimetres. When you consider that some of our smaller adult females are only about 150 centimetres, that's the bottom end of the adult growth chart, it really is remarkable how few kids we see are restrained in these seats for appropriate lengths of time. Interestingly, when I was going through the KidSafe guidelines last week, I noticed that news.com.au has a parent poll on whether they think these new recommendations are safe. Parents are being forced to put children in booster seats. Is this fair? I thought, what are some people on about? It's not a nanny state. We're just trying to keep kids safe, give them a choice when they're grown up. So I've gone the wrong way. So lap sash belts, this is a very grumpy looking teenager, isn't he, from the KidSafe website. There are very few photos of teenagers wearing a lap sash belt. We're recommending people do the 5-point test to see if kids are big enough to be in a lap sash belt. So they need to be able to put their back to the back of the seat, and when they bend their knee should be over the front of the seat in the bend. So we don't want kids sitting with their legs straight out because they're more likely to shoot under the belt. We want them to be able to have the strap of the belt running over their shoulder, not over their neck, and we want the base of the belt to be around their hips, really to prevent injuries. We want good, strong collarbones and hip bones to be taking the force of that seat belt. And the last thing I think is really important, can they stay in that position for the length of the trip you're going on? How many kids stay put in one position for more than about 15, 20 minutes? Until you get them addicted to their mobile phone or DVDs or reading in a car without vomiting, you're not going to keep them in that position. So seriously consider a booster seat. My last comment was going to be, these 5 stages of child restraint moving to adult restraint unfortunately involve money. And we know in road deaths, those who are overrepresented are the most vulnerable. That's kids, but it's also the poor. And I think of my patient base, and I think of my families who are really struggling to make ends meet. Their cars tend not to meet the safety guidelines. They tend to be living further out of town and driving longer distances. and they're the people least likely to be able to afford to go and buy new seats. We know that the recommendations are that we shouldn't be using seats more than 10 years old, but there is a large number of parents and grandparents trying to do the right thing and buying seats secondhand or getting them from neighbours or keeping Big Brother's seat and passing it down through the family. I think it's a fantastic initiative that the RACT will check seats. They'll check them for wear and tear. Seats that have been involved in accidents or have frayed straps really need to be tossed and replaced. But one thing I haven't seen, and I think we as a community need to think about, how can we keep our poorest and most vulnerable kids safe? What are we going to do as a community to try to provide seats on a hire scheme, a rent scheme, a gifting scheme, through the charities, whatever, for those kids who probably need them most? So that's a thought I'd like to leave you with. I'm not offering solutions, merely a question, and one we'd be happy to contribute to, but I think it's going to need the whole community.